The Trumpet Daily from Jerusalem.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. After the terrorist attack back in 2001, the United States, if you remember, quickly disposed of radical regimes in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then severely restricted the spread of Iranian influence all across the Middle East. But as we wrote in November 2003, this would be a long and difficult war, and one the United States would eventually lose. Today, after 11 years of war against radical Islam, you can plainly see that American losses are piling high. Earlier this month, the New York Times featured a detailed story that essentially summarized Iran's decade-long conquest of Iraq. Back in 2003, the Times wrote, Iran saw the U.S.-led overthrow of Saddam Hussein as a golden opportunity to become the dominant force in the region. It enabled the Quds Force, led by General Qasem Soleimani, to wage its own war in Iraq, a shadowy conflict aimed at bogging down American forces and ultimately pressuring them to leave. Now, while this was happening, Soleimani was simultaneously working to build political alliances with Iraq's top politicians. This is exactly what we predicted would happen in 2003. For example, my father wrote, now that Iraq has been taken out of the picture, Iran is even closer to becoming the reigning king of the Middle East. It may seem shocking given the U.S. presence in the region right now, but prophecy indicates that in pursuit of its goal, Iran will probably take over Iraq. At least it will have a heavy influence over the Iraqi people. That was from the Trumpet back in June 2003. Now today, Iraq's weak government sits idly by as Iran ships weapons and people right through the country, this time into Syria, to support Bashar al-Assad's crumbling regime there. Foreign Policy magazine wrote just last week, for several months, the U.S. government has been urging the Iraqi government to stop Iran from supplying arms to the Syrian regime through commercial flights over Iraqi airspace, but a larger amount of supplies is now crossing Iraq via convoys on the ground. It's amazing to think about. I mean, the U.S. was just there occupying that country, and now we're pleading with Iraq. We're pleading with Iraq's government to stop this flow of weapons and militias that are going from Iran over to Syria. Now, those statements there in the Foreign Policy report are based on Iraq's exiled Vice President, Tariq al-Hashimi. That's what he told them. In the article, it quotes Hashimi as saying the transit is not only aerial using Iraqi airspace, but the ground transit is becoming a phenomenon. Munitions, heavy arms, and even militias are passing checkpoints without any sort of obstruction. So there's no obstruction at all. Here we barely have time to remove all of our forces, and there's Iran walking right through the door. They barely wait for the door to swing shut on the U.S. departure before moving in and calling all the shots. I mean, these are earth-shaking developments in the Middle East. Hashimi continued in this article, the Maliki government will never be able to resist any sort of demand coming from Tehran. This means, note this means that the foreign policy of Iraq is now being geared politically and religiously to be aligned with Iran policy. This is just a matter of fact. You see, we were saying it 10, 12 years ago. We were saying it back in 1994, in fact. And now, as he says there, it's just a matter of fact. You see, Saddam Hussein's been taken out of the way. U.S. forces are now long gone. And Iran is the king in Iraq, which, as I say, is what we said would happen as far back as 1994, almost 2 decades ago. Now, America's following a similar path in Afghanistan. Its invasion of the country. I mean, if you go back to the start, of course, at the beginning, it was just like with Iraq, a lopsided conflict at the start. It only took a few weeks for the U.S.-led offensive to smash the Taliban infrastructure and to send its leaders fleeing for safe haven in Pakistan. But by 2006, at that point, America's preoccupied with Iraq. The Taliban had reemerged from the hills and surprised the U.S. forces with a major counterattack. Over time, a few months later, U.S. commanders were pleading for Washington to send in reinforcements. But then Joint Chiefs Chairman Admiral Michael Mullen told them there was nothing on the shelf for Afghanistan. You see, American forces had been spread too thin. The focus of attention was on the surge in Iraq. Now in 2009, following through on all the promises that he had made during the presidential campaign, President Obama shifted attention away from Iraq and sent an additional 33,000 troops to Afghanistan. And since the so-called Obama surge in Afghanistan, what has happened? What has transpired? Well, we've seen a dramatic rise in U.S. casualties. Of the more than 2,100 U.S. service members that have been killed in Afghanistan, about 70% of them have died on Mr. Obama's watch. Now, of greater concern than this upsurge in violence is the alarming increase of green-on-blue attacks. This year alone, there have been more than 30 attacks on coalition forces by their so-called Afghan partners. It's gotten so bad that U.S. forces now have to carry weapons at all times, even while on base, in order to protect themselves from people who are supposed to be on their side. Despite these many setbacks, however, you see the Obama administration, how it's been actively, along with other politicians in the U.S., they've been actively peddling this mission accomplished theme when it comes to Afghanistan. During the vice presidential debate just a few weeks ago, for example, Joe Biden said America's primary objective in Afghanistan is almost completed, as he said. Now, out on the campaign trail, the president takes it much farther than that. He says America has blunted the Taliban's momentum and Al-Qaeda is on the path to defeat. He said this repeatedly over and again while out campaigning. But if you look at the facts on the ground, just a few reports, there should be more, but according to one recent one, CBS reporter Laura Logan, she says that the administration is misleading the American people with this, as she says, major lie in order to justify the U.S. exit strategy. During a 60 Minutes episode back on September 30th, Logan interviewed General John Allen, who's the commanding officer of U.S. forces in Afghanistan. She interviewed Afghan President Hamid Karzai, and she interviewed a Taliban commander who had been trained by Al-Qaeda. And all of them said that Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations are now returning to Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda is definitely on the run, as President Obama likes to say on the campaign trail, but they're not running from American forces. They're instead rushing back to fill the power void that's left by a superpower that has spent its strength in vain. Now, back in 2002, not long after the U.S. forces invaded Afghanistan, President Bush assured the American people that the war against terrorism would not end until, as he said, every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. But of course that was at the beginning, the very beginning of what has since turned into the longest war in U.S. history. We've been in this war for over a decade. That's what Vice President Biden said during that debate, just before he stated that America was very near to the point of completing its objective. After a decade of war, this is from White House Press Secretary Jay Carney, after a decade of war, it's time to wind down that war and to gradually transfer security responsibility to Afghanistan. So you can see from these statements that they're conveying these ideas, these thoughts, that it's been a long and difficult struggle. Most Americans have grown tired of fighting an unwinnable war, really. So America's leaders have responded by declaring victory so they can then finalize an exit strategy. Even President Obama's political opponent on the right is out actively promoting this mission accomplished propaganda. He said at the presidential debate a little over a week ago, Governor Romney said, "We've seen progress over the past several years." He said the surge has been successful and the training program is proceeding at pace. There are now a large number of Afghan security forces, 350,000, that are ready to step in to provide security, and we're going to be able to make that transition by the end of 2014. Now, prior to that debate, the Romney camp had often blasted the Obama administration for telegraphing its timeline to the Taliban by announcing a withdrawal date publicly. But during that last debate, Mr. Romney emphatically told America's enemies that if he becomes president, he's definitely sticking to that 2014 timetable. So just like his friends on the left, he's been lulled into believing that the greatest dangers facing America are now in the past. But as Laura Logan said during a speech in Chicago, this was about a week after her 60 Minutes report aired, American leaders aren't listening to what their enemies are saying about this war. Let me just show you one short clip from Miss Logan's speech.
It's amazing to me that we constantly ignore what Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and Haqqani and all these groups tell us. This is terrorism. It's a completely and utterly different fight. Our way of life is under attack. And if you think that's government propaganda, if you think that's nonsense, if you think that's warmongering, you're not listening to what the people who are fighting you say about this fight. After 11 years of a war in Afghanistan where we're surrendering, rushing for the exits as fast as we can, not only do we not dictate the terms, but we have less power to dictate anything on the world stage.
Now, America's leaders can claim victory if they like, but that's not the way America's enemies see it. They're looking at America's retreat as a tremendous victory for radical Islam. And they're not running from American forces. Just look at what's happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, or Egypt and Libya. In all of these places, it's America that's losing ground. It's America that's losing influence. It's America that has troops on the run. Now, I told you at the start of this program what we were saying back at the start of the war against terrorism, but it's important that you know what Herbert W. Armstrong was saying long before that, more than a half century ago. He said that unless or until the United States as a whole repents and returns to what has become a hollow slogan on its dollars, "In God We Trust," the United States of America has won its last war. Now, Mr. Armstrong often referred to a prophecy in Leviticus 26, verse 19, where God said he would break the pride of our power. To study more into that, make sure you request The United States and Britain in Prophecy. That's a book that was mailed to more than 6 million people around the world over the course of Mr. Armstrong's 60-year ministry. Here's just another snippet from some of his writings, this also from The Plain Truth back in February 1956. He said, like Rome, he's comparing the United States to Rome. He said, like Rome, we've grown fat and prosperous and lazy. We're the wealthiest as compared to any other nation. And we are fast growing lazy and soft, seeking luxury and pleasure and excitement, idleness and ease, labor-saving, step-saving devices, and gadgets. Now, that was in 1956. Of course, today we see America losing much of that wealth and prosperity because of our addiction to debt and because of other sins of ours. But still, you think about our history over the past century or so, we've had it so good, all this prosperity and ease, and yet, what do we see with our forces abroad? We see a broken will that resulted in the Korean stalemate, or the embarrassing defeat in Vietnam, or an inconclusive outcome in the first Gulf War that left Saddam in power, and then now more recently these prolonged quagmires, and now retreats in Iraq, Afghanistan, and on it goes. America has long passed the zenith of its once dominant power, and God has warned us through prophecy that the day of reckoning is now here. To learn more about what God has prophesied regarding America's decline, be sure to request, as I said earlier, The United States and Britain in Prophecy. Now, we also have an important booklet about many of Mr. Armstrong's prophecies titled He Was Right. And that's an appropriate title because he was right. Now, all of our literature is free for the asking, and it's also available to you for free online at www.thetrumpet.com. Now, thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you again next time.